Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Renata Valquier Chavez, and I am your student body president and student regent, and I'm a double major in political science and biotechnology. It is my honor to welcome you to the inaugural Chuck Hagel Forum in Global Leadership. Secretary Hagel and Vice President Biden, on behalf of the student body, thank you for making this event possible. We are so excited to have you here at UNO. Our program will begin with remarks from University of Nebraska President Hank Bounds. President Bounds has led the University of Nebraska since 2015. He's a lifelong educator and a true advocate for expanding student opportunities. Please help me welcome President Bounds.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As Renata mentioned, I'm Hank Bounds. I have the privilege of serving as president of the University of Nebraska. I am so honored to welcome all of you to the inaugural Hagel Forum in Global Leadership at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. And I really can't think of a more fitting place to host a forum like this. UNO is a place for mavericks. Students, faculty, and staff who are independent thinkers, who challenge the status quo, tackle the tough issues, and bring new ideas to the table. It's appropriate for the namesake for this new forum, Chuck Hagel, is a maverick himself. Mr. Secretary, I know you can hear me backstage. Thank you for your ongoing support of our students, for your leadership in bringing events like this to the University of Nebraska. Our students will truly be the beneficiaries. There's a reason most of the people in the audience today are students. Our goal at the University of Nebraska is to prepare young people to live and work in a global environment, to have an opportunity to participate in a dialogue with two of the leading policy figures of our time will certainly enrich your experience. Not many students get to ask questions of a former Secretary of Defense and the immediate past Vice President of the United States at the same time. So, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Vice President, I've warned you that UNO students are independent thinkers, so be prepared for some hard questions. To the students in the room, I encourage you to take full advantage of this opportunity. To our visitors from outside of Nebraska, I hope you'll take some time to learn about our university. This is a special place. It's home to 52,000 students who come from around the country and around the world to study in America's heartland. In fact, 72 different countries are represented in the UNO student body. We really do bring the world to Omaha, and events like today's are further opportunity for students to prepare to become global citizens and thinkers. So with that, now it's my pleasure to introduce the Chancellor of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, Dr. Jeff Gold. As you know, Dr. Jeff Gold's been with us leading both UNO and UNMC for a couple years now, and the thing that I really appreciate about Jeff Gold the most is he is absolutely student focused. So with that, please make welcome Chancellor Dr. Jeffrey Gold. Jeff.
Well, thank you, President Bounds, and a very warm welcome to all of you on this chilly afternoon. Well, Vice President Biden, Secretary Hagel, students, honored guests, thank you so much for joining us today. To both of you, welcome back, because the Vice President and Secretary Hagel have been visitors to this city many times. My sincere gratitude also to all of you who have helped organize this very special event, and mostly to you, our students, for being here. Today's forum is part of an inspiring series that will explore critical issues with global leadership. It's in the search of creative solutions to today's global challenges. We focus much of our time here at UNO on the concepts of breakthrough thinking, of making the impossible possible on a daily basis. Behind it is the idea that conversations are always catalysts for global change. I know that this is the belief that Secretary Hagel has identified so well in his distinguished career as a civil servant, both as a United States Senator for Nebraska and, of course, as the United States Secretary of Defense. Secretary Hagel embodies something that we talk to all of our incoming students about and all of our graduates every year at orientation and at commencement. We like to say, once a maverick, always a maverick, an independent thinker who challenges the status quo. As an institution, we at UNO are blessed with a truly engaged alumni body who are leaders and mavericks in their field, and Secretary Hagel is certainly one of them. Over many years, he has been incredibly generous to our institution. He has served as an inspiration to literally generations of students, faculty, members of the community, and to myself as well. Of course, this is also a unique opportunity for our students to learn from Vice President Biden. And I am sure that both of you will have wonderful experiences to relate from your time on the Foreign Relations Committee, in the White House, and in the many, many other places that your public service has taken you. I am equally sure that when you, our students, reflect on our time together this afternoon, it will not only be of one of life's most memorable moments, but it'll also be truly inspirational. And it will help you set a course for the future, hopefully a future of service and dedication. We very much look forward to learning together. As you may know, I am a firm believer that time is an invaluable, precious gift. And I want to make sure that as much time as possible this afternoon is spent hearing not from me, but from the two distinguished guests. So please join me in extending an incredibly warm Maverick welcome to a UNO alumnus and a great friend, Secretary Chuck Hagel.
Jeff, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you. Chancellor Gold, thank you. President Bounds. And I want to thank the University of Nebraska at Omaha, all of you, for organizing and sponsoring this first Global Leadership Forum. And I want to thank our speaker, Vice President Joe Biden. My assignment today is to introduce Vice President Biden, who has had an unprecedented career in public service. Elected to the United States Senate at age 29, culminating in 36 years of service in the United States Senate. He chaired the Senate Judiciary and Foreign Relations Committees for many years, two of the most important committees in Congress. He then went on to serve as Vice President of the United States with President Obama for 8 years. 44 years of distinguished, unblemished, selfless service. But as truly impressive as those credentials are, there's an even more important part of Joe Biden. His character, integrity, and humanity. I've seen it all up close. Joe Biden and I served together on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 12 years. At my first committee meeting, he walked over to the Republican side of the Republican aisle and put his arm around me and another newly elected Republican committee member, Gordon Smith of Oregon, and welcomed us to the committee. An uncommon gesture in politics today. We've been all over the world together many times. I've seen him in every kind of a situation, some difficult, some unpleasant, and some calling for a special awareness and decency. On a trip to Afghanistan, at the height of the war, our helicopter was forced down on a mountaintop for many hours in the dead of winter. We spoke before the Kurdish parliament in northern Iraq, requiring an all-night 8-hour drive into Iraq from Turkey, 2 months before we had invaded Iraq. We, along with then-Senator John Kerry, served as official government observers during the first peaceful transition of power elections in Pakistan. And we've participated in many meetings over the years with world leaders. But a person is measured not only by accomplishments, but also by compassion and thoughtfulness. When our son Ziller was in grade school, and serious Lyme's disease was his biggest challenge, he spent a number of weeks in Children's Hospital. Joe asked about him every day and sent him notes, gifts, and football jerseys from famous teams like the Philadelphia Eagles, although the Delaware Blue Hens never made it. When my mother passed away, he called to tell me he was flying out to Nebraska for the funeral. He never made it because his plane was grounded by bad weather. These are traits you remember about people, special public servants that the public rarely sees or knows. Joe is a Democrat, I'm a Republican, but that never mattered to Joe. He always understood that what matters most in public life, as in all things in life, is character. That public service is a privilege to be earned, and it's its own best reward. I'm proud to welcome Joe Biden to UNO and to Nebraska. Ladies and gentlemen, Joe Biden.
Thanks, Chuck. Good fun. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Don't jump. Thank you very much. Really, thank you. It's an honor to be here. Chancellor, Mr. President, all the dignitaries. I understand my buddy Senator Bill Nelson is here. I saw him earlier. I don't know if he's here in the auditorium, but and also he's both the senator and governor, and one of the finest guys I've ever met with. And I tell you what, if I'm ever in trouble, he's the guy I want behind me and in front of me is Bob Kerrey, Senator Bob Kerrey. I think Medal of Honor winner, but more than that, a man with equally much moral courage as he has physical courage. And Brad Ashford, former U.S. Congressman, is here. By the way, I understand there are a group of state senators here and city council persons and regents, all of whom have to get elected. This is what we call in our business, this is a busman's holiday, to come to hear another public official speak. And before I begin, let me apologize for my back. When I looked over and I saw Omaha, I thought it was Obama. But I just want to, I've kind of been conditioned. Folks, the fact is that Chuck and I have been friends for a long time, a little bit, his wife, and they're real, decent, honorable people. And the fact of the matter is, I didn't know until years ago I came out to this university in Omaha when Eddie Zirinsky was the mayor. He had just gotten elected to the United States Senate, and I came over here for an event with him, or basically a tour of the campus. And when I understood you're called the Mavericks, it explains you. It explains how the hell you got to be the way you are. And there must be something in the water. I know that the fact is that Bob Kerrey is he went to that other university in Lincoln, but I think he must have drunk some of the Maverick water as well. The fact of the matter is that whether whether the Secretary was in Washington or traveling out in the field, the thing that impressed me the most and impressed my son, Bo, who was the Attorney General of Delaware, and spent a year in 8 months in Kosovo, and then spent a year in Iraq, and was decorated for his service. But I remember him telling me, Chuck, the thing that impressed his guys the most, he was a major. I remember when he got promoted to major, I said, "You're a field grade officer." He said, "Dad, I know who runs the Army, and it ain't field grade officers. It's the enlisted men. And one of the things that Chuck always did, it goes to who he is, as the Secretary of Defense, and even before that, every time we traveled together, he'd make sure he sat and met with the enlisted men and women. No officers, nobody else, just the enlisted. He did that as Secretary of Defense, he did that in the field, and he did that at the Pentagon. And it communicated a message to so many people that this guy understands, this guy cares, and this guy, he just wanted to get the unvarnished truth. And the best way to do that in the field, not a joke, is to go straight to the source. Go to the enlisted men and women in the military if you want to know what's going on in the battlefield. And he wasn't going to take anyone else's word for what was going on until he had a chance to speak to folks. And he did this on the front lines. I saw that mentality when Chuck and I were traveling around the world together many times as members of the Foreign Relations Committee. I remember, Chuck, when our helicopter was forced down in a snowstorm at about 14,000 feet, and we were with General Rodriguez, and who became the 4-star, and they found this ridiculous little, almost looked like a goat path we landed on. The helicopter blades extended over the side of this mountain. It's like the Sawtooth Mountains of Idaho, but it's even worse. They're just jagged rocks. And I'm standing there, we're in the wash of the helicopter, and we had a marksman with us. And so I was looking out to the next mountain, which as the crow flies turned out to be less than a mile away. But to get there, you had to go down 5,000 feet and up 6,000 feet. So it would have taken a long, long time to get there. And the snowstorm kept us from being able to get over the mountains. And I looked over and I could see on this ridge on the mountain next to us, across from us, I started counting. I saw 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, I think it was, Ben, people dressed in local garb. And I looked at the marksman with us. I said, could they get us from here? And he picked up his rifle. And I said, no. He said, I'm just checking the distance, Mr. Senator. And he said, they're 9/10 of a mile. He said, no, you can't do that. And I remember looking, Chuck, and as we talked about it, you looked, that was at 12 o'clock. And about 2:30, you could see this little tiny village that was tucked in a crevice. And with a round hut, smoke coming out of it. And all of a sudden it dawned on me, and this is why it makes a difference to go and see. It dawned on me, the idea of ever having a united Afghanistan under one rule was never going to occur in the cards in history. It would have taken them, we were 17 clicks from Bagram Air Force Base. It would have taken them a week to get there, to get through the mountains. And so it matters when you travel and you see and you take a look. Chuck knows that if you want to truly understand something, you have to go see it for yourself. You have to walk in somebody else's shoes. If you're going to make decisions that impact the direction of our country, you better understand what you're being asked to do. So I want to thank Chuck for inviting me today, but also for being my friend all those years. And I surely hope this record-setting cold snap that collapsed the dome didn't have anything to do with you inviting a Democrat to be the first speaker here. I hope that has nothing to do with it. I apologize. I began to worry a little bit. But I'm honored to be here today to take part in the inaugural Chuck Hagel Forum on Global Leadership and to speak about U.S. leadership in a changing world. I always get kidded, as Chuck and Bob will tell you, and Ben in the Senate, because I was always quoting Irish poets. And People thought I quoted it because my mother's Catherine Eugenia Finnegan Biden, because I was Irish. I didn't quote them because I was Irish. I quote them because they're simply the best poets in the world. And one of my favorite is William Butler Yeats, and he wrote a poem about the first rising in Ireland called Easter Sunday, 1918. And there's a line in that poem that I think better describes the United States and the world today than it did his Ireland in 1918 after the first rising. He wrote, "All changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty has been born." All has changed, changed utterly in the last 15 years, particularly in the last 2 years. That's why at this moment in history, perhaps more than ever, in the midst of the upheaval and uncertainty, American leadership and engagement in the world is essential to our national security, our safety, and our prosperity. Imagine for a moment the alternative. What would come from all this change without U.S. leadership? What does the absence of American leadership cost us in the world today? If the United States fails to lead, who will take our place? And where does that leave us? When America leads boldly, with confidence in ourselves and big ideas for the future, we've been able to bend the arc of history for the better. That's what we did after World War II, our grandfathers and great-grandfathers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers. They decided that they weren't going to accept the world as it had been. They decided they were going to change the world. Let me remind you why they formed NATO in the first place several years after. It was to make sure there was supported the cohesion of Europe, to set up guardrails to prevent any single country from being able to abuse power. The reason why we supported, although this administration is not, the European Union, is to prevent the fraying and rise of nationalism in Europe. NATO is the heart of our collective security and a reminder to bullies and tyrants around the world that an attack on one is an attack on all. And that keeps things from happening. Some of you, and you're all really informed, I'm confident, but there's a thing called Article 5 in the NATO Treaty. It's a sacred obligation we swore to. It says an attack on one is an attack on all. And it helped keep the peace and restrain the former Soviet Union. And we still needed to restrain Putin, who is quite frankly a thug. He runs a kleptocracy. That's what he runs. The estimates of his personal wealth and what he's stolen are in excess of $300 billion. It's like a syndicate. The European Union is the antidote to the excessive nationalism that twice tipped the entire world into a world war in the 20th century. Think about what would happen today as how can I say it, as unfocused as we are the last 2 years. If someone came along and tried to generate a Marshall Plan, thousands and thousands of Americans had died in Europe, yet our leaders had the foresight to spend, in today's numbers, hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild not only our allies, but our enemies. Because we understood that democracies tend not to go to war with other democracies. And no democracy can be sustained without economic growth. And our investment, I mean, imagine what it took for your grandparents to agree to that, and your great-grandparents. I remember my grandpop was an educated man, an All-American football player at Santa Clara University, a newspaper man in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Lost a son. All his sons were in the war, 4 of them, or 3 of the 4. And he lost one in Southeast Asia. And I remember him talking about how difficult it was. That's President Trump calling me. Tell him I'm busy, but I'm happy to help. But how difficult it was. But they did it, to take all those tax dollars and rebuild a continent. But our investment delivered incredible benefits to the United States because it meant that we didn't have to face the same challenges that our parents faced pre-World War I and pre-World War II. We created partners to meet increasingly complex challenges, new markets eager to buy American products, new allies to deter aggression, to fight with us if deterrence failed. But this changing world, in my view, and the failure of presidential leadership is generating incredible doubt about America's staying power. This is the first moment in modern memory, perhaps in the last 70 years, where American leadership and engagement is in doubt. I was just in Germany at the Munich Security Conference, used to be called the Verkünde Conference, where all of the heads of state from all the NATO countries, their foreign secretaries, their defense secretaries, their secretaries of state, they all go for this 4-day conference. And it's all off the record. Not all of it. Most of it is off the record. Chuck's been there many times. So has Bob Kerrey. So have you been. You would have been astounded because you read about it in the press. Astounded. One of our closest allies, Germany, Angela Merkel stood up and excoriated the United States and said Europe has to think about going it alone because we can't count on the United States anymore. The fact of the matter is, it was followed on by a guy who's a decent guy, our vice president, who stood before this group of allies and leaders and said, I'm here on behalf of President Trump. And there was dead silence. Dead silence. The fact of the matter is, they in fact no longer trust our commitment. The fact is that there was a robust consensus among American leaders that NATO was the cornerstone of our ability to project power around the world. But I say to my former colleagues, you'd have been amazed at how we were viewed. So the question is, everyone used to trust the basic values the United States brought to the table: decency, respect, an unwavering commitment with Democrat and Republican presidents for the last 70 years to strengthen and advance the hard-earned position as leader of the free world. It wasn't just an example of our power that's allowed us to lead. It's been the power of our example that has had the rest of the world repair to us. The power of our example. Sounds corny, but we hold these truths self-evident. It matters. It matters how we behave at home, and it matters the image we project abroad. It's how we've kept the transatlantic community strong and united, standing as a safeguard against the abuse of power by any one nation, against the lapping waves of chaos that have threatened us time and again, from external danger, from an unchecked nuclear arms race, to terrorism and its rotted out rationale of violence and fear. But our unflagging commitment to our allies has been the core mission that's allowed us to deter aggression among nations, defeat ethnic cleansing, and bolster our shared security. And still today, when terrorist organizations or rogue states threaten the safety of American citizens, we're able to ensure our own security because we're not in the fight alone. We have allies. Infectious diseases like Ebola, they don't respect borders. In 2014, with the leadership of this man, and I'm not joking, the Secretary of Defense, we're able to check and contain a massive outbreak of Ebola in Western Africa. It had the capacity to spread well beyond the continent. It knows no borders, and it boards aircraft. But because the U.S. military had the infrastructure, Chuck organized the world to set up the infrastructure that the World Health Organization or no one else in the world was able to do, and beat the epidemic. Only the United States could muster that kind of response. And look at what you did here in Omaha. You stood up one of the best Ebola treatment units in the entire world, here at this university. When autocrats seek to undermine democratic institutions, it's happening along what used to be called what the Russians call their near abroad in Europe, interfering with democratic elections in Europe, manipulating them, using oligarchs to bribe, and here in the United States of America, attempting to delegitimize our elections, including this last by-election in 2018. We've joined with our closest friends to defend the values that are the very foundation of our security, prosperity, and our position in the world. When Vladimir Putin violated international norms and actually invaded Ukraine, occupied Crimea, sent, quote, those little green men, Russian military, special forces, in unmarked uniforms across the border with the express intention of trying to replace the democratic elected government with a Russian puppet like Yanukovych. Our administration rallied our allies. They were reluctant to move, to put harsh sanctions on Russia, to make sure there was a cost imposed as they continued to move. But we strengthened the Ukrainian military and their economy. Every president since the end of the war has talked about a Europe whole, free, and democratic and prosperous. And it's being challenged as I speak to you. And only the United States has the clout and credibility to hold together this coalition. All of that capacity has been thrown in jeopardy by this administration's America First policy, where we openly question whether we'll maintain our sacred obligations. As our mutual friend John McCain said, this half-baked spurious nationalism, us against all. If we succeed, no one else can. If we fail, it's because we did not check other democracies. To actually say to some of the countries on the borders with Russian-speaking populations, like in the Balkans, that Article 5, because you didn't contribute enough, we may not protect you if Russia does the same thing to you as they did a NATO country, the same thing they did in Ukraine, where we coddle dictators. You're all young, but even in your young life, you cannot think of anyone who has thrown their arms around or chosen the word of dictators and thugs over even our own intelligence communities. The love affair, love letters with Kim Jong-un. Standing before the world and taking the word of Vladimir Putin over the entire intelligence community. Dealing with a thug in the Philippines. I could go on. Our national reputation is being tarnished. But we're at an inflection point for American leadership and for the institutions we built to magnify American leadership globally, to keep the peace. Absent American leadership to rally the free world to stand up for democracy and basic human rights and dignity of every man and woman, God knows what your generation will face if we walk away from that obligation. Front and center, we're navigating a new relationship with a rising China and a declining but more aggressive Russia. As vice president, over the time I left, I spent more time with Xi Jinping than any world leader. More hours, more travel, 17,000 miles, they tell me, in China and in the United States. China seeks to establish itself as a hegemon and a global power player. And Russia is using every tool at its disposal to destabilize and sow discord among and within democracies. In each case, we're seeing more than just jockeying for geopolitical advantage. There's an ideological struggle embedded in this as well, a competition of systems and values. There's actually a debate in some of the Eastern European countries, like a new NATO country, Hungary, as to whether or not you can sustain growth and stability in a democracy. And in a world where problems are only growing more urgent and more complex, it's in our naked self-interest to stay fully engaged, not because we're the only ones capable of leading the world, but because we can't afford to go it alone. We have to once again summon the vision as to how to organize the world for the next 50 years, focusing on rebuilding from the shared narrative of freedom and democracy that inspires nations to unite around common goals. We need leadership that sees what's coming over the horizon and takes steps to expand and strengthen our capacity to meet those dangers. That starts with investing in more alliances so we're better equipped to take on the existing threats we face, not treating NATO as if it's a protection racket, threatening to walk away unless the allies ante up and pay more. Let me remind you again, we lead the world not just by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. And we're not setting a very good example right now, in my view. We need to look for opportunities to cooperate with democracies, partners beyond North America and Europe. The free world is going to be called upon to do more than ever before, to take new challenges and take them on in cyberspace, address technologies of artificial intelligence that are evolving more rapidly than ever before with Moore's Law, countering new weapons of misinformation and new weapons of mass destruction. It's going to affect every one of you. My son and daughter, my grandchildren. That's why with the transatlantic partnership as our historic core, we need to reach out to partners beyond Europe and East Asia to fortify the collective capabilities we share. We need to reinvigorate our alliances in Asia and encourage them to work together as well. The democracies in Asia are strong and capable partners, but they continue to struggle against their own recent and raw history of conflict. It takes hard work, concentrated diplomacy from the United States to keep all of us pushing together. And we're not seeing that right now. I made multiple trips negotiating between Japan and South Korea over comfort women, when their overall mutual interests are the same, keeping the Korean Peninsula from becoming a nuclear peninsula. And it's not just we don't want. I had a long talk with Xi. He said, "Why am I so fervent about this?" I said, "It's very much in your interest and the world's interest that Japan not be a nuclear power." What happens if we walk away? What happens if the rumors coming out of the White House about disembarking from the Korean Peninsula are true and nuclear-capable North Korea continues to grow? How long do you think Japan will go, even with our nuclear umbrella promise to protect them, not becoming a nuclear power? They have the power to become a nuclear power in a heartbeat. They have the capacity to do it virtually overnight. Tell me whether your world is more safe when Beijing is facing Tokyo, both with nuclear capacity. Tell me how that works for us. We need to integrate our friends in South America and Africa to bolster a broader community of democracies. If you take a look, I made a speech not long ago that I can envision a Western Hemisphere that's united, democratic, free, and prosperous. But it requires us to help other countries deal with the rot that exists in their corrupted systems, as we've done with many countries. But what have we done? We basically walked away. In order to take radical action to address climate change and the impacts it will have on every single one of you and everyone on the planet, how can that happen without U.S. leadership? To set a level playing field for global trade, reducing the inequities and the increasingly divided societies here in the United States and all around the world, to prepare us for the dislocations we'll continue to see as technology changes the nature of work. Most difficult speech I ever had to deliver, Chuck. I was asked by the founder of the conference that's held in Switzerland every year. Would I speak on the fourth industrial revolution? Will there be a middle class? Some of you are studying that right now. What do you think? What do you think? To address with decency and dignity the accelerating rates of migration and humanitarian crises that are not going to go away and are going to continue to impact nations around the globe, in Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. There are more refugees today than any time, even more than there were after World War II. What coordinated effort is taking place around the world? What's happening? Who's leading? To champion democracy and ensure that democratic governance can deliver on its promise of an improved future, helping countries root out corruption that strangles the rule of law, cripples the ability for democracies to deliver benefits to their citizens, and literally undermines democratic legitimacy. And here's the important thing to remember. Sometimes I think many of you understand it intrinsically in your hearts. America is still able to inhabit the leadership role that we've so long filled on the global stage. The role that the world continues to need to be filled, and a role that the American people, notwithstanding the talk, think we should fill. The United States shouldn't be the world's policeman. I got elected to the United States Senate because I campaigned against the war that he almost gave his life in, and so did Bob Kerrey. The rationale for the war, I thought, was absolutely faulty. That there was this great Comintern between Moscow and Beijing, and if we didn't stop what was going on from North Vietnam, they would be coming up under the San Francisco Bay Bridge, which was the argument my generation was given. But folks, as recently as the Chicago Council survey found that 70% of Americans say it's best for the United States to take an active role in world affairs, not to step back. We don't have to be the policeman of the world. 70%, that number has grown during the past few years. Your generation understands better than most that America's leadership in the 21st century has to be rooted in our basic values, fostered by bold and innovative new ideas, fortified by cooperation with our partners. Name me a serious problem your generation is going to face that we can handle alone in the United States of America. Tell me what it is. We can draw from the lessons of history without going backwards, without returning to policies now ill-suited to the forward march of global challenges, or failing to learn from our mistakes, ignoring the challenges we've seen around the world. So let me return to the point I started with today. What will it cost us if America is not leading? Isn't investing in our alliances? Isn't relying on the world to address problems beyond their own borders before they impact us at home? Isn't that in our interest? Who will lead to solve the health crises, the outbreak of disease in a highly contagious world? How will we preserve our environment and our hopes for a future without the United States leading a coordinated global effort to fight climate change? How do we dissuade aggression by dictators and strongmen who rule through coercion, corruption, and violence, absent a united democratic front organized by us? Who will determine the rules of privacy and how we should govern the internet to maintain the values of free speech and open access if it's not the United States of America? Tell me who. Watch what's going on in China right now. Who but us can lead the world to write the rules of the road, to preserve the competition, a level playing field when it comes to trade? Be assured that if we don't do it, authoritarian powers are going to rush to shape the world according to their interests and their values, not ours. We can't let that happen. But as bleak a picture as I've drawn, when I got to the Senate as a 29-year-old kid, I was labeled a young idealist, an optimist. I can say without fear of hesitation or contradiction that I'm more optimistic about the United States' possibilities today than I've ever been in my whole life. We're better positioned than any other nation in the world to shape the direction of the 21st century. It's not because we have the most powerful military and the largest economy. We have the most productive workers in the world. Our workers are 3 times as productive as workers in Asia. We have the most agile venture capitalist system in the world. We have more great research universities in the United States of America, including here, than all the rest of the world combined. As my wife, the professor, would say, Google it. Not a joke. Every major life-changing, life-altering change has come out of a research university, not a corporation. Corporations have been able to monetize it. We're the epicenter of energy production in this new century. We have all the resources and the ingenuity necessary to overcome the challenges and to create a better future. So it's time for us to stand up and remember who the hell we are, to regain the sense of unity. It's time for us to lead again. This is the United States of America. Nothing is beyond our capacity. And that's not hyperbole. Nothing. You are the most educated, the best educated, the most progressive, and the most open generation in the history of the United States of America. You know, I often hear about how, China's going to eat our lunch. I want China to succeed. Xi Jinping always asks me why I want China to succeed. I said, so you can buy more of our products. He always asks me, why do I refer to the United States as a Pacific power? I said, because we are. And if we weren't, you would have never been able to grow. The peace and stability of the entire region depends upon us. Folks, There's nothing we can't do. I really mean it. Not a joke. We don't have to commit the sins of the past. Deciding to lead the world doesn't mean we shouldn't learn from our mistakes. Whether it was Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan or some of the things we've done in Syria. So I'm looking to you. I really am. I'm counting on you. I really am. This is the United States of America. I was raised in a household like I hope you've been raised in. There's nothing beyond your capacity. Nothing. Nothing. If a skinny guy with a father from Kenya and an Irish Catholic kid from Scranton who stuttered badly all through college can end up as president and vice president of the United States of America, you can do anything. And I'm counting on it. Thank you. Very nice. Thank you. They told me I'm supposed to come over here and sit. Thank you. Well, Chuck is coming up. Say one last thing I should have said in the speech. My grandfather, I told you about, Ambrose Finnegan, every time he'd walk out of his house in Scranton, he'd yell, "Joey, keep the faith." And my grandmother would yell, "No, Joey, spread it. Go spread the faith," okay? Am I in the right chair?
Yes, you are. Once again, let us thank Vice President Biden for his remarks. Thank you.
Joe, thank you.
I would like to now welcome you to the second portion of today's event. I am Dr. Lana Obradovich, Assistant Professor of Political Science here at UNO, and it's my great honor and privilege to host and moderate the inaugural Chuck Hagel Forum in Global Leadership. This year's theme is the role of U.S. leadership in a changing world. Let me briefly give you the topic overview and the format of this discussion. As the Cold War ended, America's position at the apex of global order seemed unassailable. With democracy's victory over communism complete, the United States appeared poised to exercise an unchallenged, benevolent global leadership based on American values, democracy, and open markets. Yet, as you have just heard, 30 years later, the coalitions and institutions that the United States and its allies built in the wake of World War II are fraying. International agreements on security, trade, human rights, and other issues are fragile at best. We asked University of Nebraska at Omaha students to think how these challenges will affect our position as a global leader, and invited them to pose specific foreign policy and global leadership questions to both of our guests. We received hundreds of questions, and I'm certain there are still many more. But given the nature and scope of this event, I would kindly request that you allow me to ask the previously submitted student questions. And without further ado, we'll begin with you, Secretary Hagel.
Ask him all the hard ones, please.
I'll make sure I do that. What inspired you to sponsor this event?
Well, I think Vice President Biden's comments that we all just heard pretty much sums it up. We are seeing a post-World War II world order change, shift. Part of that is evolutionary. Part of that is finding new approaches to new challenges, adjusting and adapting institutions to those new challenges, and, as Joe said, new opportunities. But I've been concerned over the last few years that the United States is not fully understanding how that post-World War II world order was built, what it took, not just to build it, but to maintain it and to lead in that kind of a world. And many of the Vice President's comments really dealt with the heart of the issue. I mean, we, after World War II, the United States and our allies, built a world order of what I have referred to as coalitions of common interest, institutions that multifaceted, multidimensional, whether collective security or trade organizations or international law, but all institutions that were built benefited all countries. And it allowed forums to cooperate, all countries to cooperate. They couldn't solve every problem, the United Nations being one of the first. The United Nations hasn't served and solved all problems, but just think of it this way, and what Joe's questions that he asked are rather relevant. If we had had no United Nations the last 70 years, world be better off? World be safer? I don't think so. So I wanted to, if I could, because Joe said something that's right too, not just research universities, but all universities. That's where ideas start, because that's where our young people are. That's where the future is. To maybe try to put together something here that would focus on it, give new ideas, emphasis to the reality of much of what Joe's comments were about. To summarize, the United States cannot go alone. It would be complete folly to think that we could go it alone, that we'd be better off, we'd be safer, we'd be more prosperous in this world. By the way, demographers tell us that this world's going to add 2 billion more people to it. And if we think we got some issues now, you put 2 billion more people on the face of the earth, jobs, opportunities, schooling, getting along with each other, and so on. So I just thought it was something very important and very relevant to all of us, but especially our young people. And I appreciate UNO giving us this opportunity to put something together, and appreciate Vice President Biden coming in to give the first lecture, because as much as I care about Joe Biden and as close of friends as we are, I really couldn't envision anyone who would be better to talk about this truly than Joe Biden. So that's why I did it.
I think the real reason you want to get even with me. Yes.
Well, let me turn to you then, sir. This month, while speaking to our allies at the Munich Security Conference that you mentioned earlier, you said, "This too shall pass. We will be back." Sophomore political science student Yusuf Khan would like to know, what should the role of the United States be as a global leader in the next 10 to 25 years?
Where are you, kiddo? Who asked the question?
Oh,
Behind
he's
me?
right there, front row.
Yeah.
Good question. Well, you know, I think that we should start off with how we got to where we are at this moment, just over the last 24 months or so. Again, one of the guys I argued like hell with, and we hollered at each other, and we were in different parties, was John McCain. John had a volcanic temper, as we all know, but he was my great friend and your great friend as well. And I am a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and I also am chairman of the Constitution Center in Philadelphia. And so we asked John to come up and receive the Liberty Medal. And John gave a speech when he received that medal. And he talked about what has happened just at that time in the first 10 months of a new administration. He talked about the rise of two very dangerous isms that we had never seen manifest themselves the same way in the United States before. He talked about a phony, what he referred to as a phony populism that was designed to give people who were left behind a reason to blame someone. The reason I'm not doing better is because that immigrant. The reason I'm not doing better is because that black guy. The reason I'm not doing better is that woman has an advantage, etc. Dividing us. And it's been pretty good at doing it. But the second thing he talked about, what he referred to as spurious nationalism. He talked about what the president talks about as America first. But when you examine it, the fact of the matter is that rather than trying to focus on the shared narrative of freedom and democracy that's inspired nations to join together, it's this Hobbesian view of the world in which, for America to succeed, others have to fail. Not a joke. Think about what I'm saying now. The argument is that it divides the world into us and them. And Hobbes would say, put it, a war of all against all. The only way we can succeed is if somebody else fails. And it's built walls, literally and figuratively, around the world. And it's had people face off in ways and look at us in ways they haven't looked at us for over 70 years, as stiff-arming the rest of the world. And it has, in my view, generated a sense, and it's only embraced by probably 30%, 35% of the American people, but yet it is the image projected around the world. How many of you have been able to study abroad or travel internationally in the last year and a half? Raise your hand. A lot of you. What do you find out when you travel, no matter where you are, whether you're a Republican, Democrat, or Independent? What's going on? I would be willing to bet you, even though I don't have the money, but I'd be willing to bet any of you, any one of you who went abroad, no matter what your politics are, whether you voted for or against the president, then in whatever country you went to, they didn't ask you essentially the question, what's happening? What's happening? What's going on? And so for me, I think it starts with, to answer your question, it starts with rejecting this notion, this Hobbesian notion, that it's us against all. We benefit when democracies grow. I was being completely honest with Xi Jinping when he said, why do you want us to prosper? Because when you're prospering, you are going to be more rational. And if you prosper and you create a middle class, your dictatorship cannot last. It never lasts in the face of the growth of economic prosperity that is spread. And that's in our interest. I could go on, but I won't. And think what's going on now in terms of arms control. Think of what we just did. Declaring, you've forgotten more about this, most people know, but my point is, we have to focus on basic, fundamental American values. That's why the rest of the world has repaired to us. Not a joke. That's why they come, not because we have the largest economy, the biggest army, most powerful military in the history of the world. And it sounds corny, and I'll say it again and stop. We hold these truths self-evident. That all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator. We've never lived up to it, but we've never walked away from it. We have never just walked away from it. And the world is watching us walk away from it. And they're confused as hell. And no one has the capacity to positively fill the vacuum, in my view.
I'm going to move on to a next question. And it's actually, many of our students were interested in knowing the answer to this one. The meeting in Vietnam between President Trump and North Korea's chairman, Kim Jong-un, abruptly ended earlier this morning without an agreement. What do you hope, what do you both hope will happen next?
Well, I hope, and
Is it a difficult one?
I hope I don't come across as condescending because I don't mean it. I hope the president has learned a really important lesson. Diplomacy matters. Preparation matters. What's coming out, and some of the national press are here, Mike Memley and others are here today. They report, and I don't know that, I assume it's correct because that's my impression, that the president's advisors told him that this is really, really, really going to be hard. But the president treats everything like it's a real estate deal. I'm not being a wise guy. That just let me in the room, I can convince the other party to make a deal. Well, it requires hard, and consistent diplomacy. It requires empowering people in your administration like Barack and I did empower the Secretary of Defense. When he spoke, they knew he spoke for the administration. Who speaks for the United States of America? Do you think about this now, not a joke. You're a world leader. You're sitting down talking to Pompeo, who's a good guy, sitting down talking to the vice president, whomever. Do you believe that they speak for the president? Not a joke. So my hope is the president did the right thing. He did the right thing by walking away. A bad deal is worse than no deal. But I hope now we get down to hard facts and get engaged in negotiation at the same time, making sure that we maintain what this guy did. Maintain the difficult relationship that exists between Japan and South Korea, the United States, with China and Russia understanding the consequences of an unrestrained North Korea for them. To build a consensus born out of self-interest of all the parties that a denuclearized Korean Peninsula is necessary.
Any thoughts?
I would only add that a clear objective always must be anchored to a process, preparation, as Joe's mentioned. And without those three components, you will never achieve what you hope to achieve, whether it's denuclearization in North Korea, and I think what we saw in that summit, essentially there was no reason for that summit. It was interesting, good television for 24 hours, but it was embarrassing. It really was embarrassing. Every time something like that happens, it further erodes confidence in American leadership. And do Americans know what they're doing? It can't happen any other way because the world, the last 70 years, has looked to America for leadership. We've made mistakes. We'll make more. But there's only one nation on earth that all nations can have any confidence or trust in with all of our problems. It's the United States. And when you abdicate that, you walk away from that or you screw that up, like how that summit was handled in Hanoi. It hurts us because there are ripple effects and consequences. The other part that Joe mentioned here too is, and this is really in the preparation stage, consultation with allies. Very, very important. And you can't just tweet a policy or you just can't tweet a decision. It isn't that simple. And I hope the president, I hope the president will learn from that, seriously. I don't know, but because countries get into trouble when they try to wing things. We've gotten into trouble that way when we tried to do things alone or browbeat one other country to go with us, or two. The episodes are clear over the last 50 years, and you look at the big mistakes we have made, Vietnam, Iraq in particular. We didn't have any big coalitions with us, not at all. So,
And
Can I add one thing, Professor?
Absolutely.
Think of what happened in the first summit in Singapore. Now, first of all, by meeting with Kim Jong-un, he was given a great gift. He was legitimized. This guy's a thug. This guy leaned across the table and blew the brains out of his uncle. Now, what happened? Without consulting with our ally in South Korea, we called off military exercises, which are essential for the security and stability of the combination of our troops on the Korean Peninsula. Now, what do you think that does internally to the leader of the country at that moment? Think, well, maybe I better cut a deal before these guys cut out. It changes the dynamic in a big way. And by the way, we have a model. It's called the Iran deal. It was a deal that was painful, but it was a good deal. And it brought together the three largest European powers, China and Russia. That's not a bad thing.
and they're still in the deal.
Yes.
And now we're the only ones outside the deal.
Yeah.
Right, I believe the word that South Korean government used this morning was perplexed once everything collapsed.
More diplomatic than we are.
We're going to shift gears and move to another region. Eric Cerveon, a graduate student, wrote, "As a veteran who has served as a flight medic in Afghanistan, I've seen what our commitment to fighting the global war on terror means for boots on the ground. The U.S. continues to play the world's police," says Eric, "but at what point, specifically in Afghanistan, do we say enough and bring our troops home?"
Yesterday. Look, it's become common knowledge, although I didn't talk about it at the time, that I thought this was a serious mistake. Even when we came into office, there's a great deal of pressure to increase our presence in Afghanistan. And first of all, thank you for your service. Where are you? The gentleman asked the question.
They might not all be
He
here.
was smart enough not to be here.
We have a couple of other locations where they're viewing this from, so not everybody
but
can be here.
I think we have to ask ourselves when we commit forces, and nobody knows this better than Chuck and Bob, who actually have gone and risked their lives and taken hits, and the young man Eric, who served, is the commitment of force necessarily in our vital national interest? In our vital national interest, before we send people into harm's way. And the big argument, as Chuck remembers, that existed in our administration was whether or not he's a brilliant soldier. General Petraeus was right about counterinsurgency or counterterrorism. Counterinsurgency means you put troops on the ground and you are designing a problem, a circumstance that you can bring an entire country together. Like Chuck, I have traveled almost every inch of Afghanistan in a helicopter. Not only were we up and trying to get to Tora Bora on our helicopter, because John Kerry wanted to see Tora Bora.
And then he became Secretary of State,
That's
so
right. And by the way,
It's a great country.
he also won, he's a real hero. He actually won the Silver Star, just short of the Congressional Medal of Honor. But my point is that it is a country, if you go back to talking about Ganga Din, you talk about the Brits, that has never been united in a way that there's been one strong central government. And I remember when we went to see, I went to see we may have been together, went to Pakistan, and we met with the head of the ISI, their National Intelligence Service, and a general.
yeah.
And he said to me, because we were being told by folks that unless you make a major commitment of force into Afghanistan, the Pakistanis are going to think you abandoned them. And so I remember him sitting there looking at me and he's saying, and us, and remember he said, now let me get this straight. You're training up 165,000 forces with modern equipment in Afghanistan, and 80% of them are Pashtun. My country is predominantly Pashtun, which is our problem. And you're telling me that you're going to then leave, and that's going to enhance Pakistan's security? And there's a thing called the Haqqani Network. They control the western part of the country, which has never been controlled by the Afghan government. The idea that they are going to agree to a united Afghanistan, part of which they now occupy and control for a century, is like, really? That's going to happen? And the example I gave you, the idea of one strong central government in Afghanistan, when I looked over and saw that little tiny village in the middle of godforsaken nowhere at 14,000 feet, or you go down and travel through the poppy fields in southern Afghanistan, or you go out west, it is not ready for a united country. That the point I've made is the day after we leave, whether we left 5 years ago or 5 years from now, the result will be the same. Mm-hmm. The result will be the same. But is it necessary to have a counterterrorism strategy? ISIS is there. Bin Laden was there. This guy, we got Bin Laden. We got Bin Laden because we said we'd follow him to the gates of hell until we got him. But you don't need to have a large contingent of American forces stationed in Afghanistan, in a country that is divided based on ethnicity, geography, and history. It's kind of important to know what you're getting into. And so, but what we should not be doing is what the president now did. In the middle of a negotiation with the Taliban, because they're going to have to share power somewhere along the line, and it may be in their interest. We tried to get negotiations going with them. And we tried to get negotiations going with them. The most ardent commitment we wanted was they would not harbor ISIS. They would not harbor Al-Qaeda to be able to attack us. Taliban has no interest in attacking the United States of America. They're not good guys, but they have no interest in attacking the United States of America. But at the very moment negotiations seem to be underway and Zal is getting them moving, the president says, we're going to withdraw. Why the hell would you negotiate? The one thing they want is us to withdraw. So negotiations start to try to work out a modus vivendi, how the government and the Taliban can coexist, which they could. And we say, by the way, don't worry, we're leaving anyway. Go negotiate for me. I don't know how he wrote The Art of the Deal. I don't know how the hell that's sold.
I don't have much to add, actually.
Sorry.
Well, let me then turn to sort of a broader question of the Middle East. As many of our students wanted to know, what should we have learned from years of U.S. intervention in the Middle East?
Well, I think first you pick up on what Joe just said about Afghanistan. Joe and I remember after we had invaded Iraq, soon after, and mission accomplished, appeared. The President of the United States said that we will make Iraq the democracy in the Middle East that will be the example for other democracies, and democracies will flourish in the Middle East. Well, I recall seeing the President in a meeting soon after that, and I asked him what our strongest allies in the Middle East, except where there is one democracy, Israel, thought about that comment. Monarchies are gone. You're all now going to be governed by democratic rule, people voting. So how did all those monarchies feel about that comment?
King of Jordan was gone.
Yeah, they're very supportive.
King of Saudi Arabia was, let's go.
The point being, United States of America, no other country can impose democracy on any country. You work with what you've got. It takes time. I mean, you look at our history. Our history's a little raggedy on just trying to live up to the preamble and the rights of individual citizens in the Constitution. 100 years ago, half the people in this audience couldn't vote, and civil rights and so on. So we didn't get it all right either at the first time. But America has a unique capability to self-correct because we have a Constitution, we are national laws, and I think our people. But to your question, you can't rush democracy. You can't force democracy. You got to understand the civilization, the religions, the culture,
The history.
the entire history of a country. You can work with them to get there and make the advances toward that. And I think the biggest mistakes America has made over the years is violating that and not understanding that in countries. Afghanistan is a perfect example. But the Middle East, when you start talking about the Middle East, that's a long, long way from imposing anything. I mean, I think the Middle East is more volatile, more combustible, more dangerous than it's ever been. You got non-functioning governments in some of those countries. So, again, it takes statesmanship that works with other people, thinking, preparation, working with allies. It takes time, but no other country can do it or be willing to invest that, to lead that effort, except the United States. China going to do it? I don't think so. Russia going to do it? I don't think so. India going to do it? I don't think so. It's only the United States.
But one of the things that you and I have talked about before, there's a New York Times columnist named Tom Friedman. He's really a bright, whether you agree with him or not, he's a really incredibly bright, well-informed guy. And I thought he said it best about 6-7 years ago. He said, from Tunisia to the Persian Gulf, there's really only 2 countries based on ethnicity, actually 3. He said Morocco, Egypt, and Israel. He said the rest are tribes with flags. Tribes with flags. Now take a look at Iraq. Iraq had the geographic boundaries it has, inherited after the World War I when the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, was broken up. But it is made up of 3 distinct populations with distinct interests and very different religious and political views. The Sunnis, the Shia, and the Kurds. So it was possible, and we actually went to help them write their constitution, that 7-hour ride through no man's land, laying on the floorboard of a car with people standing on mountains wondering where they're going to shoot at us, to meet in Erbil with the Kurds, was about what their constitution should say. And the Constitution says, a little like the U.S. Constitution, that they're going to be a republic. The state of Nebraska has its own school system. It doesn't have to have the same school system that the state of Delaware has. The state of Nebraska has its own rules and regulations relative to a whole range of things from licensing on. Well, that was what was envisioned in their Constitution, but we insisted, the Bush administration insisted, that there be one cohesive, totally controlled organization from Baghdad that controlled everything. And the idea that we are going to have an army in Kurdistan controlled by the Shia patrolling in Erbil was as likely as Muhammad and Jesus coming back and having a conference in Erbil. No, I'm serious. There's no possibility, none, zero, of that happening in the near term. So we spent time, Chuck and I and others, saying there ought to follow the Constitution. Give some autonomy, just like we do in our states. Thank God we have freedom of religion, but we don't impose a particular view in religion. Well, there's three completely different attitudes that they've been going to war over for a long, long time. Referred to in a derogatory way, the Shia referred to as swamp Arabs because they lived in the southern part of the country, both geographically as well as culturally viewed as inferior by the Sunnis. The Kurds in a different world. The point is that if you look at most of the Middle East, we forget the history. These countries are more tribal than they are united based on a similar culture. And it takes time. If we want to go in there, and I'll conclude by saying, if we want to spend the next 50 years there, investing billions of dollars like we're doing $5 billion a month in Iraq, Afghanistan, we can probably change it. But what is the national security interest of the United States other than dealing with terrorism, which requires consensus and allies? And we've done it.
Right.
One costly consequence to what Joe just talked about in Iraq was in early 2014, when I was Secretary of Defense, when ISIS, this little ragtag band of terrorists that nobody really knew much about, crossed the Syrian border, went into western Iraq, and 2 full divisions of Iraqi forces
And we trained.
and equipped, major equipment, dropped their weapons and ran. ISIS thought it was a trap, truly. They took over the cities, the banks, they looted everything, and that was really the beginning of the so-called caliphate of ISIS. Right. That's how it started. And what Joe was talking about, differences with ethnicity, religion, culture, history, because the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad wasn't fulfilling its responsibilities.
And they weren't going to die for Sunni territory.
To the Sunnis in the western part of Iraq.
Well, let me go back to the question of history a little bit, but in a different part of the world. Emily Rees writes, today world's headlines are once again rife with hatred, stories of bigotry, anti-Semitism, and the revival of fascism in Europe and at home. The mission of this forum largely reflects the principles of foreign policy that Senator and later Secretary of Defense Hagel put into practice during his many years of public service, including defending human rights and supporting democratic values. Now, in April of 1993, you probably recall this trip, you traveled to Belgrade to visit the then Serbian President Milosevic, and you called him a damn war criminal who should be tried as one.
That doesn't sound like you, Joe.
No. But then, in 1999, you sponsored and you, sir, co-sponsored the Kosovo bill that authorized military air operations and missile strikes against Milosevic. Now, I'm originally from Bosnia and Herzegovina. I have lived through much of that and have witnessed the brutality and lived the consequences of that war. And if I may say personally, thank you for helping stop that violence. But Emily's question is, how do we continue stopping violence? How do we stand up to abuses of power where you see them? And what do we tell our students? How do they promote social change globally?
Well, first of all, and I'm not joking when I say this, it starts, everybody talks about what leaders are supposed to do. It starts with all of you, how you treat one another. Not a joke. How you show respect for people of different ethnicities, races, and culture. It matters. It matters. Leaders' words matters, but it also matters what the attitude of the governed are. So every time, people are ready to join me in saying, yeah, look, Trump did this, that. But how about you all? How do you treat, you men treat women? How do you treat African Americans? How do you treat immigrants? What do you do? Do you live up anything close to, I hope you do, what we say we believe? So that's number one. But number two, the reason I went to see Milosevic was I was convinced, and you all know the real quick background, there was a place called Yugoslavia. It was a conglomeration of six different countries, from Serbia to Bosnia to Herzegovina and went on. And at the end of the Soviet era, it split. They'd all started to declare their independence. And Milosevic, doing what every charlatan dictator has done throughout history, he made a speech, a famous speech, about Blackbird's Field. It's a place where he went and talked about how the Serbs saved Christianity in Europe back from the Turks, 13?
1889, I think.
1396. And he painted this picture that Serbs were being persecuted, their children were being hung on racks like chickens when they're decapitated. He went through this whole thing about how they've been put upon, and he enraged a part of the country, Serbia. And so I went to see him. I was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. And I remember my father. My father, he was a high school educated man, but incredibly well-read. And he used to talk about how could leaders have actually sat down with Hitler and thought you might be able to deal with him. So I went into his office, and we sat at a little conference table. And he was there, I was there with one other person, John Rich, who was on the committee. And at one point, I was pointing out all the things they were doing, engaged in genocide. There were rape camps that existed, where in Islam, if a woman is raped, or she is abused or violated, there's an argument that she is not worthy to be part of the system anymore, etc. They had actually rape camps for real. And so I went through all this with him, and he said to me, he said, "What do you think of me?" And he spoke perfect English. He had a PhD. He was a bright guy. And I said, "I think you're a damn war criminal. I'm going to spend the rest of my life seeing you're tried as one." Which really made my group feel great about how we're going to get out of the country. For real, not a joke, not a joke. And the end result of all this was that it wasn't until we were able to show in Srebrenica there were boxcars, people were being put in boxcars, men being put in boxcars and shipped off to mass graves where they were dig these mass graves, and just like the Nazis did. And finally, people rose up. But then there was still this historic division. Kosovo were mostly Muslims, Kosovars. Well, they remained part of Serbia. They wanted their freedom. I had a son who won the Bronze Star, was anyway, I don't want to start. He passed away. But he volunteered as assistant U.S. attorney to go to Kosovo to set up their criminal justice system in the middle of the war. In the middle of the war. I went back, Chuck, 3 years ago. You know, the only war memorial to a foreigner in the entire country of Kosovo is a 15-foot monument dedicated to my son, Bo. They, not because of me, at the foot of Fort Bonsteel, they built a new 4-lane highway, and they named it Joseph R. Bo Biden Memorial Highway. And former government officials and present government officials stood up and they talked about the conversations with my son and what my son advised and the rest. The point is, we insisted. Europe will never be whole and free and at peace until the Balkans are integrated fully into Europe.
That's true.
And so many of your friends and relatives, I guess, but your countrymen were slaughtered.
Yes.
Remember Haris Salajic?
Haris Salajic, yes.
You pronounce it correctly, I pronounce it. But Haris is a good guy and a friend. And I remember him coming sitting in the Foreign Relations Committee. And I said, when I passed trying to pass a resolution, which you eventually passed, and I convinced Bob Dole to join me in it, to lift the arms embargo against providing weapons to Bosnia and Herzegovina and the opposition. Because when the war was over, when the country split up, Milosevic gathered all the weaponry that existed in the country, and he owned it all. And he was sending Serbs across the Drina that were taking out people of different faiths. And I remember him coming and sitting down. And I had this proposal, lift and strike, lift the arms embargo and strike these people who were engaging in genocide. And one of our colleagues who was a friend said, no, that'll just make more people will die. You won't be able to resist them. And he said, my wife and daughter are sitting on a mountaintop in the cold back home. At least let us choose how we die. Let us choose how we die. And we finally told Lord Owen and the Brits they were full of malarkey.
Yes.
And we stepped up. And tens of thousands of lives have been saved. But thousands upon thousands were
Lost.
needlessly slaughtered.
Absolutely.
God love you. Where are you from? What part?
Star.
I've been there. God love you.
You know the story.
I do. You know, remember the camp up there when people were coming and they were putting people who were escaping from the south, coming north. And my wife was with me and Bob Dole. And there'd be these big UN vans with look like giant dump trucks. And they're Irish aid workers helping the people who were escaping. And I was talking to a couple and their family about their escape through an interpreter. And all of a sudden the Irish workers, they're coming. And I remember running outside and seeing this dump truck. It was freezing cold with people that were shoulder to shoulder, stacked like wood stacked, only stacked upright. And as they opened the tailgate to let people out, there was a mother crying. Her son, infant, had dropped out of her arms and was down in the middle, and she could not get to him because there was no way to move, and he suffocated to death. And then the couple I met with, 3 children and a mom and a wife coming from the south. And he's explaining how they escaped, and he said, but I had to leave my mother and my youngest daughter, who could not walk on the mountaintop because we could not make it and take them along? How many people made a Sophie's Choice in your country? You deserve a lot of credit. God love you. I really mean it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. But it was you. It was both of you who stood up and did something.
I might just add, because
Yes,
I can't improve on what Joe did. This is the whole point of this lecture series, global leadership. United States global leadership. No other country in the world could sit on a stage and talk about that, about what they did. This country can. But there's a question, are we going to continue to play that role in the world?
That is up to them.
It's up to them.
At this point, we still have hundreds of questions left, but we're out of time. I would like to thank you both. Secretary Hagel, thank you for sponsoring this event, this incredible event at our university, and for continually nurturing the next generation of American global leaders. And thank you, Vice President Biden, for speaking to our students and for addressing these important issues and challenges that are facing our country today. Thank you all. Thank you to our students. I apologize that we did not get through all of our questions. Thank you to our faculty and administration that put countless hours in making this all happen. And hope to see you all next year. Have a great evening.
Nice job. Great job. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
While you're all talking, thank you. Thank you. Nice to see you.